The Martian by Andy Weir, 50 Shades of Grey by E.L. James, The Celestine Prophecy by James Redfield, Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. All these works of literature are now quite well known, some on the border of being cultural phenomena. Despite their disparate subject matter, all four of these works intersect at a meaningful point. They were all initially self-published. These, along with a plethora of other success stories, serve as inspiration for a multitude of aspiring authors who have chosen to self-publish their work. Our podcast, Homespun Script, is dedicated to telling their stories, talking with them about their work, and listening to their experiences as self-published authors. The goal is simple: provide indie and self-published authors with a platform to promote themselves and their work. While providing this space hopefully does help, we encourage all our listeners to further support these authors by writing positive and engaging reviews of their work on a platform we all know of but will remain nameless. Doing so is a simple, easy, and direct way of supporting them. And now, on to our guest. Hello and welcome to the podcast Homespun Script. My guest today is John L. Simons, author of the science fiction epic Explorers of Rinth and the soon-to-be-released urban fantasy novel The Saga of Bjorn Unfrid. John, welcome to the recording room. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure and privilege to talk with you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
So tell me a little bit about yourself.
So I've been writing a very long time. Since the early 90s, but I got sidetracked on a few things. I had a comic book store, and then I started after I did that for I think it was 10 or 12 years into that, and then I did I founded a comic convention.
Oh, wow.
And I sold that off in 2018, and then we had the pandemic, so I returned to writing. Mm-hmm. And I started writing novels. The first one has not seen the light of day, but the second one was the first one I published, which is the Explorers of Rinth that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And after that, I started writing the Saga of Bjorn Unfrid. And I started writing it because I still wanted to write after I finished doing all the edits on Saga, but I didn't have anything. After I did all the edits on Explorers, I still wanted to write something, and I didn't have anything. So I started fooling around with the story, and the next thing I knew, it was a novel.
Oh, if only that could happen to everyone who has an idea that just happens organically and naturally like that.
It's a very short novel.
So it sounds like you have a long history of interest in things like science fiction, fantasy, and comic books. You owned a comic book store, and you had the convention. What was the genesis of all this interest?
Well, I learned to read from comic books. I often say that Stan Lee taught me how to read. I still have the first book that I ever read, which was Giant Size Doctor Strange #1. I failed first grade reading because I didn't want to read. And my parents would read comics to me. And then one night they brought me a comic and they wouldn't read it. And it was that book. And I did so badly at it. I was angry. I'm like, I'll do better next time. And then, I ended up with a degree in English literature. So it was a very effective strategy on my parents' part, but I'd always liked telling stories. I read science fiction. I read I read comics. I read voraciously, and I decided that when I was going to college, I wanted to learn how people wrote. So that was why I studied English Lit. I didn't want to be an English teacher or anything like that. I wanted to learn the nuts and bolts of it. And so I wrote short stories, quite a bit in the early 90s. But then I decided it was time to, come up with some sort of business or something that I could do to support me while I was writing. And comics were kind of a big thing then. They were hitting a high point. So I opened a comic book store with a couple of friends because I was stupid. So,
that sounds like a great idea to me for that time. But
Yeah, well, I didn't have any experience at all, which is why I thought it was a great idea.
Hmm.
But I learned a lot, and I had the store for 16 years.
Oh.
Um, and the comic convention came about because my wife, I got married by that time. My wife said, "Look, stores, it's rough. There's not a high profit making thing, and
Hmm.
you need a backup plan." And so I thought, to me that was like I need to think about another business. When really what she meant was I need to think about getting a job.
Hmm.
So we had a little disconnect there. But I spent about 2 years researching. This time I was doing it different. Instead of just running into a business, I spent 2 years researching the convention industry,
Hmm.
and I ended up starting a convention called Comic Palooza down here in Houston,
Hmm.
and it took off. It grew really well, and I ended up becoming partners with Houston First, which runs properties for the city of Houston,
Hmm.
and then I eventually sold out to them completely. So that was how I got into it. I decided to do conventions because down here there was nothing. It's a huge market, and
Oh.
it was a glaringly obvious thing to do if you were in my position, but nobody was doing it. So
Yeah, the very idea of founding a convention as a business is something that wouldn't even occur to me. So, you're working with other conventions right now, and founding other kinds of conventions, or working with them?
well, I after I sold it, I was on a non-compete clause, so I couldn't do that. Um, but last year, I'm on a board of directors for an entertainment industry nonprofit here, and we put together. I'm out of the non-compete now. We put together the Houston Media Conference, which is an industry B2B film and television conference, and
Hmm.
we had our first year last August. And I'm working on a new event that I would like to do either in the fall or in the spring out here where I live in Katy. Katy is a small town on the edge of Houston. It's part of Greater Houston, right? But
Hmm.
it's its own town, and that event would be a pop culture book festival. I don't want to do a
Hmm.
Comic Con. I want to do something for the literary industry,
Hmm.
but it would have more pop culture elements than you typically see in a book festival.
Hmm. Okay.
And so that might happen soon. So yeah, I like doing events.
Cool. It sounds like definitely a success story, going from comic book store owner to doing this. Yeah.
Well, going anywhere from comic book store owner to something else is probably a success story, but
Oh, well.
I mean, for most comic book store people.
Okay.
But
I wouldn't know. I haven't owned one, but it sounds like a dream job for a lot of people, and I can imagine it being rewarding.
yeah, it's challenging though.
Hmm. Yeah, I imagine the business side of things might be a little bit taxing.
Yeah, it's different. There's a lot to do and a lot to know. You got to wear every hat, you know.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So anyway, I had enough free time after selling Comic Palooza. I got to really spend time writing, and I found weirdly enough that I had morphed from a short story writer into a novelist.
Hmm.
And I realized that my entire writing had changed by owning a comic book store because it
Oh,
was a
interesting.
comic book and game store.
Hmm.
And I had spent years, I'd spent years doing pickup games for whoever came in and wanted to learn how to play a role playing game. And so I wasn't using modules, I was just making stuff up as I went.
Hmm.
And I had to make up characters on the fly and learn how to insert them and develop plots like
Hmm.
on the spot, right?
Oh.
With an audience right there. It was a lot more like improv theater in a way.
Hmm.
And what it really taught me to do, it just ingrained in me, is um, to build individual motivations for characters and create subplots.
Hmm.
And so pretty much what you were reading in the saga of Bjorn Unfrid, that was all on the fly.
Hmm.
That whole
Oh.
that whole book is I'm a pantser.
Okay.
That whole book, I have an idea of where it's going, maybe, but it all developed very organically based on the motives of the characters as I created them.
Hmm.
So that all came from this intensive role playing that I did for years. So
yeah, I agree with you that game mastering or dungeon mastering, I assume in your case, or yeah, game mastering or dungeon mastering, take your pick. But that's, I think, an undervalued skill to develop when it comes to storytelling, because you're not doing it, you're doing it in relation to a whole bunch of other people who are right in front of you. And navigating that territory with several other people who have agency and motivations is, it's a complicated thing to do. And to do it well is definitely a skill. And I can see how that translates.
It changed me from a plot-driven writer to a character-driven writer.
Oh, that does make sense.
Yeah. So I don't worry about plot a whole lot when I'm writing. I just have an idea, because if you're writing the characters, they develop plots on their own.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that does make sense. So let's talk about the upcoming novel, The Saga of Bjorn Unfrid. I partially want to call him Barney Unfriend, but I won't do that quite yet, which I thought was very funny. But it looks like I haven't read The Explorers of Rinth, but I have read the advanced copy that you sent me on The Saga of Bjorn Unfrid. Thank you for that, by the way. I loved it. It looks like it's a decent bit of a change from your first book. How did The Saga of Bjorn come to be?
This has a fabulous origin story. So the way it came out was this: I had finished I was working on the final edits of Saga, right? Or enough Saga. I keep saying that, of Explorers of Rinth. I was working on the final edits for Explorers of Rinth, and that was a big process. That's a huge book. That's a 200,000 word book. Okay. And so edits was pass after pass after pass. So I was nearing the end of it, and I was on Twitter, because, you're a writer and you kind of have to develop a network in different places. So I was on Twitter, and this one writer that I interacted with occasionally, his name is Gabino Iglesias, and he's a horror writer, and he's a really good one. Okay. And he posted the story on Twitter one day. He is much better on Twitter than I am, or X. I'm sorry, X. He's much better on X than I am. He's got a lot of followers and people like him, and he posts a lot more frequently than I do, But he posted this story, and the story went that he was going to the Bram Stoker Awards, which is the biggest award show for horror writers, right? He was going to it, and he just landed at the airport, and he got into a cab, and the cabbie, was taking him to the airport he was supposed to go to, and he was chatting with him. And the cabbie found out that he was a writer. And the cabbie's like, oh, well, if you want to make a lot of money, I have some ideas you should write to make a lot of money, right? It's just ridiculous. And so he gives them these 3 ideas that Gabino Iglesias should write. And so he thought this was such a crazy story that he, of course, posted it. And he posted the 3 ideas.
Oh, I got to hear them.
Okay, so 2 of them I don't even remember. But the third one was, you should write a story about flying Viking criminals from Toronto.
That's oddly specific.
Yeah, it is. It is. And everyone, all the people, and Gabino has a big following. So everybody's commenting. Everybody comments on all his posts, right? So he posted that. Everybody's like, yeah, that's crazy. The cabbie was nuts, just this.
Yeah, it sounds like sharks with lasers.
Well, but they're like, this is so crazy, a cabbie telling a well-published author what he should write, and he's crazy. And I'm like, yeah, but and I posted, I said, yeah, but you know what? I think I want to see that story about flying Viking criminals from Toronto. And everybody else is like, yeah, I kind of would read it too. Yeah, I'd want to read it.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, I thought maybe he'd suggest an anthology or something, and we get a few short stories out of it. And I'm like, okay, he's going to write it. And nobody did. And I'm like, geez, I can't get it out of my head.
Right.
So I'm like, I'm not doing anything. When I want to write, I'll write it. But Flying Viking Criminals from Toronto sounds like it's either a parody or like it's a mindless action adventure story.
Right. It sounds almost like a prompt that one would be given just as
That's
a
right.
challenge. Let's see if I
That's
can
right.
make this
Except,
work.
yeah, exactly. So I'm like, it's really the kind of story that if you go in any direction someone's expecting, you're going to write something that might be entertaining for 5 minutes, but it's kind of trash, right? And I'm like, so this is kind of challenging. I think I'll do this. So I started writing. I wrote the opening scene for it, and the opening scene was only half of what it is now. But I went back and fleshed it out later. But I started writing it as a series of just flash fiction. I had done a flash fiction anthology. That's a whole different story. But I had done a flash fiction anthology for the release event for Explorers of Rinth. And so I was kind of in a mindset where flash fiction was how I was. That was sort of the mode I was in at the moment, which is a huge change from these giant chapters with explorers going down to flash fiction. But that's what I was thinking. So I'm like, I'll just write a couple little flash fiction stories, and maybe I'll have a short story or a novella out of this. And I started writing it. I'm like, wow, I'm liking this, because I was able to navigate between all those ridiculous elements in it and make a story that was at once humorous but not stupid. It has some meat in it. It has some adventure. It has a character who's fairly formidable, but it's not a crazy action adventure story. And trying to hit that sweet spot in there was a lot of fun as a writer. It was great, and this story was very entertaining to write. But I wrote it as a series of flash fiction. So like when people go to it and they're expecting, kind of like normal chapters with cliffhangers and how they flow into each other, it's a little bit different. You could almost read it a chapter a day, like a serialization. And it almost through the entire book that would kind of work in that way. But that was how I started writing it. And then after a while, I realized, it's actually a short novel. It ends up at 46,000 words, and a typical novel is 70,000. So, so it's a novel. But that's the origin story of it. And then, by the way, just to put the cherry on top, Gabino Iglesias, who was on his way to the Bram Stoker Awards, won the Bram Stoker Award for that year.
Oh, that's a little bit poetic,
so, yeah. So it's very poetic. The Bram Stoker Award winner gets advice from a cabbie. I wrote a novel.
Yeah.
But it makes it very hard to write the blurb for this. I haven't come up with a blurb I can write, because anytime I start reducing it down to a blurb, it begins sounding like the ridiculous prompt again.
Yeah, I can see that happening. Yeah, but a couple of things there. First off, I want to talk about Bjorn at some point, because it sounds like that character was very fun to write.
Yeah, he was.
And second, it doesn't seem as though anything in the story was forced.
Yeah.
It didn't feel to me as though you're trying to I'm trying to take this element and jam it into the story because that's what the prompt said, or that's what the parameters were like. Everything flowed pretty well. And it is apparent that we're in a somewhat different world than we actually are, with all the realized mythology and things like that. But that's the genre.
With the
that's
alternate
fine.
history that it's got with Canada and how that develops. Yeah.
I was wondering about that because I read that. I'm like, I'm not familiar with Canadian history at all. And so I was reading that. I wonder how, my lazy Google skills didn't check it out. But
I actually wrote this. One of the things that helped make it not be forced was that I cheated, and was as lazy as I possibly could be, because, I wasn't expecting to produce a novel out of it. So I'm like, I made it easy. I went to the University of Houston, and I wanted to put Bjorn in a current time, so I put him there in the 80s when I was at U of H. And so I was doing some really easy things there, but it allowed me to introduce elements of the world in in a very natural way, without forcing it, because I put him in a new situation.
Oh, okay.
He was traveling to a new country as much as Canada and the US are similar, they're different countries. And in this world, they're culturally more different than they are in our world. So he was going to a new country, and that gives you the opportunity to explain a lot of things. And I snuck stuff in through the classes too. Like, I have the scene where he's in history class, and that actually explains the point where his world diverged from our world. Because in our world, the Vikings who came to North America in, what was it, 1050, or I can't remember the exact date, but it was 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, thereabouts.
They integrated into the Native American tribes, and they're just sort of gone after a while, right? And in his world, the difference is that they proliferated as the Viking culture across Canada and developed a symbiotic government with the Native Americans. And so that's why the Canadian culture there is different, and that's how it differs from our world. So a lot of the location, putting them on the university campus, that really helped me make it seem a lot smoother and less forced. I think that's my opinion on it anyway.
I like the 80s references in there. Cracked me up as well. Watching MacGyver in syndication. Yeah, I remember doing that. And the B. Dalton bookstore. I remember those. Yeah, there are a couple others as well.
I have one regret. I never really mentioned hairstyles. I might still put that in there, but I could still slip a hair.
Oh, you have time, I guess.
Slip a little bit of that in there, but yeah, I mean, it was kind of fun writing about the 80s. So.
So let's talk a little bit about Canadian Vikings then. I sensed a pretty solid familiarity on your part with Norse mythology, at least according to my very limited knowledge of it. But you've woven quite a bit into the narrative, as you've already mentioned, and I'd love to hear more about your approach toward incorporating this mythology into the novel.
First of all, I have to say, on the topic of Norse mythology, I've read Norse mythology since I was a kid. I read plenty of stories, but as a kid, they were typically adaptations for kids. I read comic books, so I was familiar with all the Marvel Norse mythology, which is not very close to the actual Norse mythology.
Right.
I've read up on it a little bit. I have some passing, superficial knowledge of like runes and the linguistics that I kind of looked up for this. I think that with as much material out there using Norse mythology as there is, I can't say for certain that I'm using the most authentic Norse mythology that's available. But I did try to go back and go to some of the source material behind the pop culture Norse mythology when I could. I won't say I was exhaustive with it, but the main idea, the main driving idea for me behind Norse mythology has always been that, the Norse differ from us or most of the other cultures I know, because in Norse mythology, the good guys lose, they lose. Thor dies, Odin dies, Ragnarok, they all die. And, the Vikings are like, okay, that's what happens, but that doesn't change how we are or what we do. And to me, that's kind of the fundamental motivating morality behind these characters, right? And they also don't see life as black and white as we do. We've got in Judeo-Christian world, we've got a very good bad kind of dichotomy. And in Norse mythology, people are not, and if you read sagas too, which I mentioned a reference to one of the sagas that I read in college myself, Njal Saga, which was fabulous. But if you read those, if something is really good for one person, it's probably bad for someone else, Like,
Yeah.
yeah, it really sucks for your house to be raided and all your family murdered and all your gold taken, but that was really great for someone else, And
Yeah.
there's a real way that the Vikings keep an eye on both the simultaneity of good and bad, right? And this is
Hmm.
part of the thing that I really wanted Bjorn to have. He does not see things all
Hmm.
as the black and white the way we do, and that applies to the spiritual world as well. I don't have him
Hmm.
following Thor like you usually do. I mean, he's fine with him, but I have him following a
Hmm.
very conflicted character, Loki, who's we see him as evil in
Hmm.
the way he's portrayed in the West, and he wasn't really worshipped by the Norse, but he's a he's a character much like a person. He has certain things he believes in, and he's conflicted. He's at one time the trickster, but he's also the one who's going to stand up to you and tell you the truth. Truth telling is very
Hmm.
important in Norse culture. They would be honest to you even if it had a really bad result a lot of the time. And I wanted to capture that part of that ancient culture as well. So
I can definitely see that in the character of Bjorn because he tells the truth all the time, and it's always, well, not always, but frequently, it's only part of the truth, but it's the part of the truth that he sees. He's not trying to mislead
yeah,
anybody, and yeah, it sounded like in that capacity he was very fun. He must have been very fun to write. He was fun to read. I'll
well,
definitely give that. But yeah, I got almost like Terminator vibes from him, where he sees something sort of how it is from his perspective, but it still is from his perspective. So it seems kind of culturally out
yes.
of
And
context.
now the only thing is he is very sarcastic. He does have his own sense of humor, and so sarcasm. When you say something sarcastically or ironically, that's not an untruth. So he's not quite like a
Hmm.
Terminator because they they don't have any sense of humor at all. But
Oh yeah,
but
true. Yeah, very true.
yeah, for him, a lot of it is about parsing out what is true and what is important. And he doesn't care if people
Mm.
know. He doesn't care so much about how people see him because that's just part of being truthful and being true. People are not all going to
Hmm.
like it, and so he's not very swayed
Hmm.
by opinion at all.
This also following up on this idea of, I don't want to say blurring the distinction between good and evil, but entering and describing a world where things are not black and white, and what's good for one person may not be good for another person. Reminds me, I saw that in the character of the crone
Yeah,
quite a bit, where they're the kind of these scales, and the the economy of ethical action almost does seem like a zero sum game at times with her. I don't know if that's the best way of
yeah.
describing
I
it,
don't,
but that's
I
the
don't know if it's
impression
a
I got.
zero sum game, but I mean, she's a little bit more complex character. Like she likes people, but so
Hmm.
the crone is one of the spirits that he sees. That's sort of his thing, is that he can
Hmm.
he can see the spirit world. And so the
Hmm.
crone is actually what I call in the book one of the major arcana, right? So, and there are arcana from each mythology. So she's actually from a Celtic, or British.
Oh,
You've
okay.
got the maid, the mother, and the crone, and she's one of the three. She's the crone. She's the old one who appears. She represents the old woman near death, right? And
Hmm.
so the major spirit forces in this world, I call the major arcana, and she's definitely one of them. She's a major force, and they're very hands on with people. That in this
Hmm.
world, we interact with them even when we don't know it, and they interact with us, and they
Hmm.
watch over the people who are connected to them in some way. And so that's kind of why she's in here. She's got her own things that she does, but there's definitely a political world behind behind everything that the arcana engage in with each other that we don't really understand. We get
Hmm.
just a glimpse of it and how that relates to Bjorn. So you get a little bit of that, but her purpose there, it has to do with her following the character of Irina, who is connected to her in some way, which I don't ever go into. But I mean, those are the things that these spirit characters don't necessarily always volunteer. Basically, Bjorn gets roped into a much larger entanglement between major spirit forces, and he's a pawn in that. So yeah, you got that. I don't know that it's really a zero-sum game, but
Okay, yeah, that's probably not the best way of putting it on my part.
So the major arcana, they are timeless, and they've seen generation after generation of humans. And so any particular single result is not necessarily very important in their mind. I mean, does that make better sense?
It does, yeah. I'm thinking, because I was having I don't say a difficult time, but the crone's motivation seems very complicated and almost like foreign. The way you said, it's not the kind of thing that we would understand fully because we don't have full access to the world.
And we don't have perspective. I mean, if she's seen 10,000 generations of humans, she's not so worried about having a particular happy ending for anyone. It's not about that kind of thing. So I don't know if I can go into any more detail on that, but does that help a little bit?
Yeah, not necessarily. I don't want to give away too much. Oh, yeah, it does. It's interesting. Also, I want to talk a little bit more about Bjorn's conception of sight, or not conception of sight, but his, I hesitate to use the word special ability, but he sees things differently and he sees things other people don't. And this is one thing I really enjoyed about the book and really appreciated, especially right fairly early on. I think maybe in the third or fourth chapter when he's walking through the homeless encampment. And you describe there's just a couple of quotes I want to read if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay. When he's looking at one of the homeless men, the walls of the man's mind had been eroded by drugs until there was no barrier to keep other souls out. Bjorn felt as if he had fallen into a pit. And then when viewing the another person, he said he saw things as parts. Life was disassembly. Objects were not the sum of their parts.
Yeah.
And it's seeing things in a much different way. And obviously that permeates throughout the book, but the way you described that just really gave me a better perspective on Bjorn and what he was doing. I thought it was also very unique how you did that.
Thank you. Well, and in that particular instance, it's kind of two different things there, because that, the idea behind sight is not new. I didn't invent anything. I was drawing as much as I could on things that would be familiar to people. And we've all heard the term sight, or, somebody having a special talent or perceiving the spirit world, in different families or different cultures. And so Bjorn, he's one of those people. He's got a talent, but his is a lot more powerful than normal. So he can't just see a ghost. Maybe he can see everything if he tries. And so it lets him have a lot of insight into the spirit world, but it also makes him vulnerable. So when he's walking through that homeless camp, he's basically open to all these people in a way that other people aren't. And he hasn't learned to protect himself well enough for his level of sensitivity, right? So he becomes very vulnerable to the people who have no defenses themselves. So that's how he is drawn into their lives, kind of against his will. He's not trying to, invade their privacy. He can't help it. And but he's young, and he's never had anybody to teach him how to protect himself. So when he gets drawn into that person, he sees their life story. He's experiencing what happened to them. And in that particular case, that was a homeless man who was suffering from schizophrenia. And schizophrenia it's a very strange mental disorder. It's first of all primarily biological. It's genetic, and it can have a lot of different kinds of effects. But one of them that it can have is the the effect of making it difficult for you to perceive things in their whole. And part of what I drew on there was actually things that I was reading in the 80s. There was a book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, or no, The Man Who Mistook His Hat for his wife, I think it was.
Yeah,
you're familiar with it. Okay.
Yes.
So, but it was a case study about a man who he was schizophrenic, and he had progressed along along the course of the disease, and he had lost the ability to see everything all together. And some from another generation, people would recognize Sybil. Sybil was a story about a multiple personality woman. There was a movie done about her in the 70s, I think. Sybil's mother, was schizophrenic, which is what prompted her to do a lot of the behavior that made her daughter turn into a multiple personality, which is not a genetic disorder. And her mother had a similar thing where she would watch something and she would not see the same things as someone else. And so I just thought, when he's falling into these vulnerable, when he's in contact with these vulnerable people, someone like that would be extremely vulnerable and disorienting at the same time.
Oh, yeah.
Because that would take you into a very different perception of reality that few people would be prepared for. So,
yeah, it's almost like a vampire drinking tainted blood, or blood that would be laced with hallucinogens, but sort of in an empathic and emotional way.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I think so.
The overall shape of the book, I thought, was fairly unique and interesting, and we don't really get a context for the literal content of the grand finale until fairly near the end. And it seems like a very slow build toward a very big explosion, which I found really engaging. I'd like to hear more about your strategy here.
So this is kind of a hard thing for me to speak on because, like I said, the plot develops as I go, right?
I think that answers the question to a large degree. Yeah.
Like I have an idea. Yeah, I have an idea where I'm going. Like when I sit down to write, I'm like somebody who's got their backpack on, their walking stick. They look out and they can see a mountaintop that they want to go to, but they don't know what the valleys are going to be. Right? I just kind of go. And as I go, I develop different ideas. Like I have an idea in my head. Oh, I want to do this scene, But they sort of come out of the entire process. They're a revelation to me as I go. And I found if I try outlining, everything I write is total crap. Right? Like it's just awful. This process allows me to be really creative. I am best when I'm doing things improvisationally. So part of it is that, it's a short book, but it has plots and subplots, and the overall plot, you can reduce a plot typically to a few actions. But in this book, the plot really isn't about the actions. Like if you look at I won't give them away right now.
Right.
But the actions that you have that constitute the final resolution, they're compressed right at the end. But the plot of the story isn't that. The plot of the story is really about his realization and coming to terms with who he is, because he kind of fights his role in life. The whole thing with his spirit animal, and how he doesn't get along with them, and all these things. He's not what he wants to be.
Yeah,
and that starts from very early in the book. But it's not until maybe the very last line, when he sort of comes into who he is, when you realize that the whole plot of the book isn't just those final, the fight scenes and everything. It's the entirety of it's his emotional journey.
Yeah, it's not the events; it's more about Bjorn himself. And you said
Yes.
your character development driven.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really, from an action standpoint, it is exactly as you described, but the whole book is really tied up in this thing that is a series of, a long progression
Mm-hmm.
that's through a lot of scenes over time.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, so that's all I can say is it really was just driven by the characters. And there were things I'm like, wow, this would be cool. And that's how it ends up in there. I think, this would be really cool. And
Mm-hmm.
and the one thing that I did know was that, this is not a book that's designed to be one you read while you're at the beach and like, oh, that was nice, and you toss it away. And
Right.
this is a book about somebody who goes through some hard things.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was writing, and because that's Norse, that seems like it's in keeping with Norse storytelling, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to maintain some fidelity to the way the Norse saw the world. He's not
Mm-hmm.
going to have a yay, happy ending kind of thing. That just doesn't
Yeah.
make sense.
Right.
And so, when I was writing this, in my mind, I was thinking about Greek tragedies,
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. Oh, I can
because
totally see that now. Yeah, that makes sense.
I was thinking about Greek tragedies. I was thinking about Greek tragedies a lot. I was thinking about the sagas.
Mm-hmm.
The sagas were very complex stories, and they weren't necessarily happy endings. You had lots of characters, and some that you like would die, and there was always conflict that we would look at today and we'd say, "Well, that was just stupid,"
Mm-hmm.
but it was because the people were, they had certain codes of conduct they were not going to deviate from,
Mm-hmm.
and they had things they believed in, and they were going to do them even if it was bad for them. They're never going to say, "Oh, you know what? I don't I don't really believe in this, but I'm just going to let this go this time."
Mm-hmm. Sure.
That's not how those books were, and this is really like a throwback to literature from 2000 years ago
Mm-hmm.
in a way.
Oh,
So,
yeah, I can see that with someone being thrown into a situation where they're sort of forced into a certain path of action, and
yeah.
there's not a whole lot they can do to get out of that.
Yeah. And he talks about, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about destiny, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, you have choices that you can make within that. But
Mm-hmm.
there's a certain end destination, but you have choices you can make within it. And that's really the parameters of decision making, right?
Yeah.
And how you what kind of person you choose to be within those parameters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Bjorn actually says that a couple times, doesn't he? Where he says, "Yeah, I
Yes.
know what the end destination is, but it's my choice how I get there."
Yes. Yes. He does. Again, degree in English literature, right? So it comes out.
It shows. It definitely shows.
Yeah.
So, what were your favorite parts of the book to write, and which are you most proud of in the end? And I realize there's probably some overlap between those two.
Yeah. So there are different parts that I like for really different reasons. There's one that I'll tell you that I'm not going to tell completely because
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to give it away because it's too critical.
Mm-hmm.
One that I really liked was the scene where he's going to talk to Irina when everything has been messed up,
Mm-hmm.
and he's all confused in front of her door, and he goes in and he was
Oh,
quite
right.
surprised by what he found, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is a plot climax, if you will.
Yeah.
um, but I like that because it really subverted what everyone is expecting out of it, and I think I was able to deliver it in a way that is going to surprise just about everybody.
Yeah.
And so far, the people who've read it, no one's prepared for that scene.
Mm-hmm. I certainly
Um,
wasn't. Yeah.
yeah, and nobody was prepared for it, and I think it was completely in character with the characters who were there,
Mm-hmm.
and with certain things that had been laid out, and it was good. It really fits. It fits the genre, right? It fits
Mm-hmm.
the way the story's developing, and
Yeah.
so I was very proud of that, because I'm like, it's really hard to write a climax to a key plot point
Mm-hmm.
and make it good and completely unseeable.
Mm-hmm.
That's hard. I don't know if I'll ever do that again, but
Mm-hmm.
I was very proud of that scene.
One thing I
And
thought I really liked about that scene as well was it accentuates or underscores how maybe sort of young and maybe inexperienced in the world Bjorn is. Because
yeah,
a lot of how he's presented is he's on top of things, he's true to himself, and he knows what's going on. And he kind of punches above his weight class in terms of maturity and how he comes across, at least to the other people on
yeah,
campus. And right at that scene, he's just floored. He doesn't know what to make of the situation.
yeah. Well, that's also when he kind of learns that there are others who are actually a lot more powerful than him,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right.
um, and in a way that was not, I mean, that he understood but did not experience previously. So I
Mm-hmm.
mean, yeah, there's a lot of things in there, and I think that you're right. And I mean, there are a lot of points where Bjorn does stuff that's sort of like, if he were more experienced, maybe he wouldn't have done them. But I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he went to college. He's going to college. He's
Mm-hmm.
going there and he's learning all kinds of new things. So yeah, I mean, I'm glad you saw that. That was something that I definitely wanted to be part of the
Mm-hmm.
book.
Yeah.
And then there's another scene. It was actually the last one that was written. Um, well, and let me say that, like, the final the final scene of the book,
Mm-hmm.
the climax, the whole thing. I really like that. I think that it was a very hard thing to set up and execute.
Mm-hmm.
The way I did it,
Mm-hmm.
um, because having tragedy in mind, it's easy to screw that up. It's very
Mm-hmm.
hard to execute it in a way that doesn't feel like it's plot driven,
Mm-hmm.
if you see what I mean. And
Mm-hmm.
so I was proud of that one too. But then there was one that I just came out way better than I expected. And I can actually talk about this one a little bit without giving away too much.
Mm-hmm.
But it was suggested to me after I'd finished the first draft. I went through, because the book is actually written like a series of flash fiction, most of it.
Mm-hmm.
I could go back and add things without disrupting anything. And
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to add a few things that had more, like, uh, context with the setting.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, I went back and wrote the scene in the library. That's early in the book. I went back and wrote that one.
Oh, okay.
And I went back and I wrote the one with, the very short one with Kev and Edward Albee. And that's also early in the book. Those were just sort of
Mm-hmm.
fun. You're on campus, and these are the things that happen to you on campus, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And by the way, Edward Albee, I put a reference to him in the book, right?
Mm-hmm.
I met Edward Albee quite by accident myself
Oh, cool.
at U of H. I was actually at the opening night of some little play, and there was like nobody there but my friends and me and half a dozen other people, and I end up talking to Edward Albee.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, he was a presence on campus, so I wanted to put something in there as a nod to him, because he was an awesome person.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was telling my friend, actually the cover artist for this book, I was telling him about these scenes that I was adding, and he's like, "You should add one where he's talking to Sam Houston." And I'm like, "What? Why? I don't know. Maybe I should." Because it takes place in Houston,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not just the University of Houston campus. And I started thinking about what that meant. I'm like, well, what would that look like?
Mm-hmm.
And so I read a little bit about Sam Houston, and I found out some things about him I'd never known. I hadn't known that he had lived with the Cherokee for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I found out that his name in Tsalagi, the Cherokee language, was Kolana. He was the
Oh, okay.
Raven. That was real. He was known as the Raven, and I'm like, this made a real historical parallel for Bjorn. And so I wrote this story about Sam Houston that people who know Sam Houston are probably mostly not going to recognize.
I certainly didn't. I don't know a whole lot about Sam Houston anyway, but
even people who live in Houston often don't know about Sam Houston. He was the guy who founded Houston. I mean, well, he's the guy Houston's named after, but he was the first president of the Republic of Texas, and he was our representative in Congress when Texas became a state, and he was the leader of Texas. And he was a huge figure, and he was very accomplished. He was this, and it was at a very tumultuous time in American history. And so he's an interesting historical figure who, he's more significant, I think, than a lot of other historical figures. He was a lot more interesting than I expected. And he had this very rich Native American connection that I'd never known about. And that fit with the story very, very well. And so that piece I really enjoyed. I wrote that and I sent it to my editor. The editor had read just about the whole book by that time. And I said, "Oh, I've got this, and I think it's going to go between this chapter and this chapter." And he sent it back with some edits. And my editor was like, this is one of the best chapters in the book.
Cool.
He really liked it too. And I think that one turned out fantastic. I liked it.
Yeah, that one made a mark on me as well. I noticed it.
Okay, good.
Yeah, a few little moments I liked that are sort of random, but shouldn't give away much of anything on the plot. When Bjorn is reading A Canticle for Leibowitz in Russian, after only 2 semesters of learning Russian and having a somewhat difficult time with it, I just thought, oh, good luck with that one, buddy. It's gonna be a rough time there. But nice little nod. I love that novel, A Canticle for Leibowitz.
It was fantastic. And by the way, originally in the original version, he was reading something by Isaac Asimov.
Oh, okay.
But I got through and I thought, I need to go with the idea of tragedies. Everything he reads is a tragedy. Like he's always reading stuff because he's in college, right? And I'm like, I'm going to pick A Canticle for Leibowitz. And part of the reason I picked it was because that was the book. When I started this, I was thinking a lot about A Canticle for Leibowitz because it's a very short book, but it really punches very hard.
Yeah, there's a lot in it. Yeah.
And so I was thinking about that, and I'm like, now I'm going to use that for this scene. And so I'm glad you picked up on that. It's an amazing book.
It is, yeah. Also, Kev's rumination on the process and ritual of eating crawfish. And I hope you don't mind if I read one little section of the text here. Okay. And Kev is saying at one point, "But with crawfish, you pay attention to what you're doing. You think about your food, and it takes a long time to finish a plate of crawfish, so the whole world has to go away for a while. It's meditation with calories." And he contrasts that with a different sort of approach toward eating, which consists of just getting the food, putting it in, and treating food as fuel, whereas this is a ritual and more of a process. And a very short section that doesn't really contribute much to the plot, but it's just a really nice moment, I thought.
Well, thank you. And Kev, so he's different from the other characters in that most of them speak in very concise ways. That's kind of how I write. And Kev is really designed to just occasionally go off on a rant or some sort of semi-random thing where he's talking and maybe not even breathing a lot at the same time. And that's kind of what he does. Is there a place to eat? And then he gives you like a dissertation on crawfish.
Right.
And so that's kind of how he talks from time to time. I don't know if you saw that a lot, but
it did come out in unexpected places, kind of randomly. And I thought it was a good way of writing. They're 18 years old or something like that.
Well, I think we've all known people who will just start talking and then they'll be off on some, long thing. You're like, where did this come from? And
Hmm.
that's how he speaks,
Yeah, but he seemed like someone who was very self-conscious and trying to present a certain image at times. But when that image drops and he just goes off talking about something like crawfish, it's incredibly insightful. And he sounds much more insightful than what he would ordinarily present as. So that was a neat scene.
Yeah.
The crone tapping her foot to pop music at the concert was a nice little addition.
Yeah, thanks. So the crone, she's a major arcana.
Hmm.
I really wanted to get more into her personality, but I mean, in a way, it wasn't the right vehicle for
Hmm.
it. She's not a character the way Kev or Bjorn are.
Hmm.
So I couldn't really get into it. And she's also not as likable. Like she's the reason a lot of things go wrong.
Hmm.
But she's also the reason why certain things go right. You
Hmm.
know, um, she's not. She's kind of a mixed bag there. But if I'd had time where I could have really brought her personality in, I would like to have presented her more like she's an old lady. Like we've all known old ladies, and she is largely like any of them.
Hmm.
Even because that's what she represents.
Hmm.
And I wanted to do some fun stuff with that. So
Hmm.
I had a couple moments there with her,
Hmm.
even though I would have liked to have done more.
So, can we expect a sequel? I couldn't quite figure out if this was sequel directed or not.
It's not sequel directed, but it's
Okay.
going to have a sequel. For one thing,
Okay.
it was incredibly easy for me to write.
Hmm.
It was because it's first of all short, but the way I wrote it, it was writing as flash fiction islands of text was really easy and fun. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, I'm going to write a sequel. I have two different paths in mind to go, and maybe I'll do both of them.
Hmm.
I already started a story from Kev's point of view.
Hmm. Oh, interesting.
I have the first one, I have the first scene done for that, and I have a plot line where that section is from his point of view.
Hmm.
From Bjorn's point of view, there's plenty to do. This book was all about him coming into his own as a person and as a power, right? Because he
Hmm.
has a lot of power, and along with that, there's sort of an office, a responsibility laid on him, which is sort of hinted at in the conversation with Sam Houston.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so there's a lot that I can pursue there with him too, and I have ideas for that as well. In
Hmm.
fact, I could have finished the editing a little bit sooner if I hadn't spent one day mainly just thinking about all the
Hmm.
ways that I can go with Bjorn. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean there'll be a sequel to it, maybe a sequel and a branching. I mean, we'll
Hmm.
see. But it was a lot of fun to write.
Hmm. Yeah, it looks like the kind of book where you could maybe not a sequel, but another story or another perspective placed in the same universe or the same world.
I mean, it could be either. I mean,
Hmm.
I could probably do two or three books in a series
Hmm.
following Bjorn's life.
Hmm.
And I definitely want to do one from Kev's perspective.
Cool.
But my thing is that I'm used to following a lot of different characters. Like I said, going back to role playing, where I
Hmm.
have a bunch of characters, and I have they each have their own thing they want to do. I'm used to following a lot of different characters, so it would be very easy for me to go off and follow in several you paths. You
Hmm.
know, so I just have to decide what stories I really want to tell and which stories I think people are really going to want to hear.
Hmm. I look forward to more writing in this world. I think it'd be really interesting.
Thanks.
So are you self-published or you go through an independent publisher?
No, so I decided that I was going to self-publish,
Okay.
but I figured I would like to be a publisher
Hmm.
because if you go to all the trouble of promoting yourself, you might as well leverage that across multiple works.
Hmm.
So I actually have a another book that I published by another local author. It's called Outfoxed, and it's
Hmm.
spelled funny. It's Outfauxed.
Oh, okay.
So That is a historical mystery set in the British countryside in 1895,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very good. And that's written by
Mm-hmm.
Corey Peters, and she's got a sequel that's probably coming out later this year.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm working on that side, and I want to build toward being a small press publisher, publishing
Oh,
a
okay.
range of authors in the area.
Okay. So self-published amplified. You have your own publishing company.
That's the idea. Right now, I mean, it's pretty much just me. So,
Mm-hmm.
but that I mentioned that I was looking at doing a pop culture book festival,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's part of the promotional idea behind it, is I want to build something where I can put the works of not just my works, but the works of, my writers as I'm developing them, at the center, and
Mm-hmm.
feature them in ways that writers can't normally be featured by
Mm-hmm.
publishers.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a lot of experience with that. So, it's keeping fingers crossed that I can
Right.
make that
Yeah.
happen.
I'm really impressed that you have your own publishing company, or that's the goal that you're working toward.
Well, I mean, it's pretty modest right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wouldn't undersell yourself at all on that. What advice would you give to other people who are in the process of writing a novel and trying to publish, and are maybe thinking about going this route of self-publishing?
Develop a budget,
Mm.
do some research, find out how much it costs to do
Mm-hmm.
different parts of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're really serious, don't skip the editing.
Mm-hmm.
If you skip the editing, you're writing for your own fun.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to publish and really do, and I think if you're going to the trouble of publishing, try to make money at it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you do that, make sure that you have an editor, and you have to have a promotional plan.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very aggressive out there. So when the plan fails, be prepared to pivot and write a new plan.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the things. You need to promote it like it's a small business, and
Mm-hmm.
you need to have a budget and operate it like a small business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are frequent issues brought up by other authors who I've interviewed. The editing process, the cover, and there are all kinds of small expenses or points within the process.
As a small business, like I had when I had a comic book store I opened it in 1994, and I opened it on $8,000, and that was nothing, right? Like I should have done it at that time. Probably should have had $50,000.
Oh,
okay, but I did it on but doing a novel you can do on $1,000, $2,000.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
right?
okay.
It is, as a small business, you can open it on practically nothing and pay for the things that you need.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean you shouldn't research it and have a plan for it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't have a plan, it's much harder to make something actually happen without an actual plan for it.
Mm-hmm. John, thank you so much for joining me. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I very much enjoyed reading the Saga of Bjorn, of Barney Unfriend. I'm going to think of him like that for a while. I won't give out why.
Yeah, that's fine.
And so I look forward to more work within this world and within this context. And yep.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Best of luck to you as an author, and wish you all the success.
Thanks. Have a good day.